Hey there. So take a look at this. We've all seen it a million times, right? It's the world map. It's the backdrop for news reports. It's hanging in our classrooms. It's probably on our phones right now. It just feels like a fact. Simple, objective, real. But what if I told you that it's not?
What you're looking at, that is not the world.
It's an argument. Yeah, you heard me. It's a story about power and territory and control that's just been frozen in time to look like some kind of timeless truth. So the real question is, who's making this argument? And what are they actually trying to tell us? Well, to figure that out, we've got to go back in time.
See, to really get what this map is all about, you have to understand something kind of mind-blowing. Our world of neat, separate countries with these clean, clear lines between them, it's actually a super recent invention.
Before our modern way of doing things, the world looked completely different. I mean, the medieval order was this tangled, messy web of overlapping authorities. You might have been loyal to a local lord, the church, and a king who lived hundreds of miles away, all at the same time. Boundaries were fuzzy, and who you knew mattered way more than some line on a map. What came next was a totally radical idea. A world sliced up into exclusive territories with fixed linear borders, all watched over by this big, impersonal state. It was a complete rewiring of how we think about political space.
Now, a lot of people point to this one moment in history, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, as the birthday of this new system. But honestly, that's kind of a myth. It wasn't some majestic portal everyone just walked through. Instead, it was this slow, super messy transformation that took centuries. States figured out how to use what's called logistical power, basically using science and engineering to control nature itself, which helped them tighten their grip on authority. And by the 19th and 20th centuries, this model, this idea of a country stuck inside its borders, had become the only legit way to run things anywhere on the planet.
And a huge reason this all happened comes down to one key concept: legibility. Just think about it for a second. A real forest or a real city neighborhood is incredibly complex, right? It's messy. So to govern it, states had to simplify all that reality. They created standardized units, like plots of land, street addresses, permanent last names, things that made messy human life visible, measurable, and, this is the most important part, easy to tax and control.
And what was the #1 all-star tool for making the world legible? You guessed it, the map. And here's the key insight, the thing you really got to get. Maps don't just show us the world. They literally help make the world. They take this dynamic, flowing reality and they freeze it into a picture that looks permanent and totally true.
So, here's the crucial point. Cartography, map-making, became a technology of power. Maps made these brand new straight-line borders look like they were just natural, like they'd always been there. And how'd they do that? Well, they just erased anything that didn't fit the picture, like indigenous communities or the homes of the poor. They even created this legal fantasy called terra nullius, or empty land, which was the perfect excuse for colonial conquest. A map could literally dream up a tidy, governable state before a single soldier even showed up.
Okay, so we've got this modern way of carving up space. So what? Why does it matter today? Well, because this way of seeing the world has locked our thinking into what the geographer John Agnew calls the territorial trap.
And this trap is built on 3 really powerful assumptions that we almost never stop to question. First, that dividing the world up into countries is just the natural way of things. Second, that there's this big, solid wall separating what happens inside a country from what happens between countries. And third, that a country is basically just a box, a container for its society. You know, like French society only exists inside the borders of France.
So what's the big deal? What's the problem with being in this trap? The problem is that the real world is so much messier than that. And when we try to shove reality into these neat little boxes, we end up creating these huge, sometimes unsolvable problems. And you can see it playing out all over the place. Let's just take the oceans. We've tried to force our territorial logic on them by drawing lines for things called exclusive economic zones. This has led to really intense fights over resources, like what we see happening in the South China Sea. But here's the thing. Those lines on a map mean absolutely nothing to fish or to pollution or to ocean currents. This whole mindset lets countries treat the shared high seas like it's somebody else's problem, which makes it nearly impossible to actually manage this fluid, interconnected system that we all depend on.
And it's not just a problem at sea level. When you look up, the limits of this thinking get even crazier. I mean, where does a country's airspace actually end and outer space begin? Who's responsible for all the junk orbiting our planet? The atmosphere itself is the perfect example. Air pollution, greenhouse gases, they don't carry passports, they don't stop for border control.
Our flat, two-dimensional logic is completely failing when it comes to these three-dimensional shared realities.
But then, in the 20th century, a totally new perspective emerged. Suddenly, we had the power to see the Earth not as a jigsaw puzzle of territories, but as a single, unified whole.
When the astronauts on Apollo 8 snapped that famous Earthrise photo back in 1968, it changed everything. It had this incredibly profound impact. The poet Archibald MacLeish, I think, captured the feeling just perfectly. For the very first time, we could see humanity not as a bunch of warring tribes on a map, but as fellow travelers on this single, fragile spaceship Earth.
So this spaceship Earth idea, it became this huge symbol for unity, and it kicked off global environmental movements. But there's another way to look at it. Some thinkers call this the God trick. This view from nowhere that pretends to be objective, but is really a kind of imperial master view. It flattens all of Earth's diversity into one picture, and it hides the ugly truth that power and wealth and environmental harm are not shared equally at all. This big, all-seeing image, they argue, was actually super useful for promoting a very specific political agenda, a global order led by the United States.
So if the map is just one big argument, can we make a counter-argument? Well, people all over the world are doing exactly that. They're challenging this old way of seeing things and trying to literally rewrite the map.
One of the most amazing challenges is the rights of nature movement. I mean, this is wild. Instead of treating land and rivers as just property to be owned and sliced up, countries and communities are actually granting them legal personhood. The Wanganui River in New Zealand can now legally own itself. This is a direct rejection of that old colonial idea that nature is just a pile of resources to be controlled inside a border.
Another really powerful tool is something called countermapping. This is all about using the master's tools against it, right? Using the technology of mapmaking to fight back. Activists and indigenous groups are creating their own maps to show what the official maps erase. Things like traditional land uses or migrant pathways or how gentrification pushes people out. It's a way of reclaiming space and telling a totally different story from the ground up.
And finally, there's this beautiful concept called marronage. Historically, it was used to describe enslaved people who escaped to so-called untamed places, swamps, deep forests, to build their own free communities. This idea just flips the whole script. Instead of seeing these spaces as backwards or needing to be civilized, marronage sees them as places of freedom, of emancipation, places where new, more just societies can be imagined and built, far away from the iron grip of the state.
So here's the bottom line. The lines on our maps, they feel as real and permanent as mountains and rivers, but they aren't. They are the product of centuries of history, of power struggles, and of very specific ideas about how the world ought to be organized. And the most important part, if they were imagined once, they can be reimagined.
Which leaves us with one final big question. If the lines that divide our world aren't fixed, if they aren't facts of nature, but are really just arguments made by people, what new maps should we be trying to imagine? What new arguments should we be making? The next time you look at a world map, just remember, you're not just looking at a picture, you're looking at a story. And maybe it's time we imagine a new one.